Welcome, everybody, to Week Two's lecture, going over the evolution of the arms trade system. I hope you guys enjoyed the Week 1 lecture and the reading material that came from that. And I hope that you took a lot from it, especially the concept of the state and arms production and transfer kind of being intertwined as far as their foundation for the modern conceptualization of the state and the modern conceptualization of arms transfers and arms production. Now, remember last week we stopped at the Industrial Revolution and we actually didn't go into the Mobility Revolution which followed. And the reason for that is as you get into the readings in week two, um, the book The International Arms Trade by Edward Lawrence, he begins essentially at the 1930 time period. Now, what Lawrence does within his book is he really brings down into a micro view how the arms trade shifted between different eras post World War One. So unlike Krauss's book. Sorry, I always get these between Krauss and Katz. Katz is another really big arms transfer author, or was. Um, in Krauss's book, Krauss looks at kind of like this 30,000 foot level where your eras of time are pretty large, right? So we're talking about, the Industrial Revolution, which in his book essentially lasted for around 200 years. And then you look at the Gunpowder Revolution, which essentially lasted around 400 years, right? And these were very macro looks. As we're getting into Lawrence's book and looking at the arms transfer system post World War One, we're really beginning to take a microscope to the arms transfer system itself to really understand how these small shifts played a big part in different eras of time. Now, before we get directly into Lawrence's books, I want to go over a few goals for this lecture, and then I also want to be able to go through just kind of some basics of arms trade scholarship, as well as some of the data and resources that you can utilize within this course and outside of it as well, having to do with arms transfers and arms production. So, the goal of this lecture for week two is going to be, first of all, for you to understand a multitude of things. The first thing is being able to understand how the arms trade research has evolved since the end of the First World War, and this is where Lawrence's book comes in. In Lawrence's book, we're going to look specifically at what he defines as the boundaries and environment, characteristics of the units at play, the structure and stratification of the arms transfer system, as well as the modes of interaction and the types of regimes that took part in any particular time period in which he's looking at. So it's really trying to take a microscope to really understand all the inner workings of arms transfers during these different periods of time. What I also want you to walk away from this lecture with is also an understanding of how to conceptualize and measure the arms trade system itself. And we're going to go over some concepts like the difference between value and quantity and how the media and the press briefings tend to obfuscate the difference between value and quantity in arms sales and how that may matter. I also want you to come away from this lecture understanding that the major sources of arms trade are still out there. So CIPRI is one large one. The ACDA, unfortunately, which was run by the U.S. government, actually ceased data within the past year, which was really interesting and upsetting at the same time. But within these resources, I also want you to be able to understand the weaknesses within actually trying to measure the arms trade. So even the stats that we do have, why they may or may not be true. And the readings for week two, you can thank me for this. So it is only going to be one book this week. It's going to be Edward Lawrence's book on the international arms trade. I gave a link for it in the D2L page. It goes to the Open Library site. Now, you are going to have to create an account to access the book for free. But trust me, it's well worth it. The book is getting more and more difficult to actually find in person or a physical copy of. And I'll kind of go into the arms trade scholarship a tad bit. The unfortunate part, and Lawrence's book plays a part of this too, is most of your foundational books, like Krauss's book, those are out of print now. So they're getting a little bit more difficult to find. But I always like to, whenever I do teach this class, is to be able to provide you the material so you don't necessarily have to go out and buy books that first of all are out of print, and second, some of the books are just exorbitantly expensive for some reason, probably because there's not too many of them left or around. And I just don't believe, just get up on the soapbox, right? I don't necessarily believe from an academic perspective that you should necessarily have to go broke trying to buy textbooks to understand a subject. So for this course, I think everything, if I remember right, within the entire course, I will provide on the D2L site for you to be able to access for free. So you don't have to go out there and buy books. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out and buy the books. I mean, having these books is always a very nice resource, especially professionally. You are going to kind of deal with or be tangential to the arms trade. These books are always an invaluable resource for me in my day-to-day job as well. So it's always nice to have them around, but the nice part about this course is I'm not going to require you to go out and buy those. Short of it is there is a link for the Edward Lawrence book in D2L. You will just have to sign up for the open library access. That's all. So if you guys have any issues trying to access it, please feel free to reach out to me, and then I will try to troubleshoot the issue with you. Now, when we talk about the data on the arms trade, whenever you see a news story that says that the U.S. transferred X amount of $1 million of arms, or a number of equipment like 15 planes and so on, there are traditional sources which actually collect all of that data year by year by year. The traditional sources within the arms trade scholarship is SIPRI, the ACDA, and then the UN Arms Trade Register. Now, there's pros and cons to all of these. The SIPRI is probably the easiest to access and probably the most comprehensive. And I did leave a link there on the slide itself. So it's at SIPRI.org. That if you go to databases within the, if you navigate to the website, click databases and then go down to the arms transfer, and then you'll have different options. You can print out based on the arms trade register, which is going to show you the actual equipment, and then the TIV tables, which is going to show you, I believe, just the value of the equipment. So SIPRI is probably the most comprehensive at the moment. In the arms trade scholarship prior, ACDA was a great source until 1999, when it was taken out, and then it was put back in, I believe, in the early 2000s, and actually just ended, like I said, just about a year ago, which was really interesting. The ACDA was essentially the U.S. government's reporting of arms transfers around the world, which also gave an interesting insight, especially when you're looking at data from the 70s. The ACDA was arguably more accurate than SIPRI or any other particular data source during the Cold War, especially with Eastern Europe and Russian arms transfers, just because the majority of their data was probably coming from CIA sources who had a better idea of what was going on than nonprofits that were out there. You also have the UN Arms Trade Register, which is still active. The only weakness with the UN Arms Trade Register is it's relatively new, and countries don't necessarily have to report to them, right? And most don't. So that's obviously an issue. It's still a good resource. It's just not going to be as comprehensive as SIPRI or the older ACDA data. It's getting better, though. That's one thing that I will say about the UN Arms Trade Register. Now, whenever you look at arms trade data, so the screenshot there on the right is actually from the SIPRI website, and it's looking at the trend in international transfers of major weapons from 1979 to 2018, and we can actually infer a lot of information just from this table here. So it's looking at the volume of arms transfers. This is going to be billions of dollars. Now, it's trend indicator values. So it's not directly speaking to the value of arms. It's talking about more of this kind of measurement of value that kind of approximates how much arms is actually being transferred. So it's not the exact amount of money, but it gives you an idea of the trends of the values of arms transfers through time. Now, what's really interesting about this table here and what's interesting about arms transfer data in general is you can usually infer a lot about the stability of the world looking at arms transfer data. So, as you see, we peak up in about the 1983 time period as the US and Russia are transferring arms around the globe. Again, this is kind of the height of the end of the Cold War. We also have the Iraq Iran War, which was a major uh, uh, importer of weapons around the globe for both countries. And then you see it drop off post Cold War. You see a minor uptick late 90s, but then it drops again to 2005, and then it's been on a slow increase ever since. So what's really interesting about it is you can see kind of the end of the Cold War there, and then you can see the beginning of the War on Terror, essentially beginning in '03 and onward. So let's go into the weaknesses of the data. Now, there are validity issues. The nice thing about SIPRI is SIPRI acknowledges the weakness of its data prior to 1970. And the reason for that is really prior to 1970, arms transfers were just really difficult to measure. SIPRI does rely on research and also voluntary government data. And as you can probably imagine, many countries who do transfer arms aren't exactly forthcoming with all of their data. So prior to 1970, the data is a little iffy. They do a pretty good job. They have data going all the way back to 1950 onwards. So just realize that if you ever look at the data, the trends are probably pretty accurate, but the actual data itself, if you look at the actual value, it's probably not entirely accurate. But that makes sense, right? Like anytime that you do look at arms transfer data, we have to remember that states have an incentive to misreport or misrepresent the arms transfers that may come in or out of their country. Going outward, if the U.S. exports arms, we may not want to report arms that we are exporting out to places which may look a little bit bad on the international stage. And that goes for any country that's going to export arms. There is an incentive to misreport, at least on your exports. On your imports, it flips a little bit. You don't necessarily want to report on all the arms imports because if you are a country that solely relies on arms imports, you may not want to show anybody the entire data of arms being imported in your country because it shows your military capability. Remember that most countries around the world still import the majority of their arms. If all this data was freely out there, you could infer military capability based on the types of arms that they're trying to import. And there is a reason to misrepresent that as well. When we look at measurements, value isn't always a good measure. $100,000 worth of guns is different than $1,000 worth of aircraft, right? Or 100,000 just quantity of guns is going to be a lot different than 100 planes. So we have to be aware of the measurement issues which tend to come along with this. I get frustrated all of the time when there is a bombastic media piece that looks at, let's say, U.S. arms exports out, saying that they're worth millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. The reason why I get mad at it is because often it's insinuated that there's a large amount of military capability that goes with those arms, and that's not necessarily untrue. But what I have an issue with is, especially if you're looking at high-tech arms, if you're looking at state-of-the-art military weaponry, it's increasingly expensive. So we have to also pay attention to the fact that, yes, $1.2 million looks really, really, really high. That's a lot of money. I think that we can all agree on that. But when it only means that you're importing one missile worth $1.2 million, it may not necessarily be something that we should get all too upset about. But the same is on the flip side. If I'm looking at $1 million worth of basic AK 74s or AK 103s being exported from Russia, that's probably a lot of rifles that I'm going to have to pay attention to. So value doesn't tell the whole story. We also have to look at the prices of weaponry across the board under similar weapons systems. Russian equipment has a tendency, and so does Chinese equipment as well. Per unit value is a lot lower than Western equivalent pieces of weaponry. And that has various reasons for it. It may not be as high tech, or it may just be that the cost of labor to build it in those countries just isn't that high, so it isn't passed on to the buyer, right? But we have to be aware that weapons do cost different amounts. A Sukhoi 30 is not going to be the same price as a brand new F-15, right? The F-15 is going to be a higher priced item. Does that necessarily mean that the F-15 is better? Not necessarily, especially when I can get two Su-30s for the same price as a brand new F-15. Right, so we have to be aware that if we're just looking at the money too, that doesn't tell the entire story. So just be aware that if we're looking at arms transfers, we not only have to understand the value of the transfer, but we also have to look at the quantity of the transfer and what they're actually transferring, right? Because value and quantity don't say the same thing. The majority of your data also misses a really, really big point here, and that's the value of serviced and licensed production. As we're entering into this kind of new era post 2000, we're entering into very internationalized and globalized arms trade and arms production system. The majority of the contracts that I deal with in my job day after day after day have more to do with the value of technology and defense services being transferred out. What does that mean? Well, that means that the U.S. may be able to provide Saudi Arabia with the majority of their aircraft maintenance through contractors. That's not captured in the majority of the arms transfer literature. Neither is licensed production. So when France made the deal with India to allow India to license produce the Rafale, that's not captured. The contract to actually buy the licensed production itself, yes, that's captured. But if India keeps building Rafale after Rafale after Rafale, each one of those planes is not captured in the arms transfer data. The initial contract to allow the technology transfer is, but that's it. Right, so that doesn't necessarily tell the entire story. So we aren't measuring these increasingly common aspects of arms transfers, and that's these intangible transfers of technology and know-how that we're transferring every day. That's not necessarily captured. We also don't account for offsets as well. So although you may see an arms contract that is worth $2 million, it could be that it also has $50 million worth of offsets. Right, so it's that value is going to offset the value of the contract. So let's say that I go ahead and I transfer in. India is a great example because they have huge offset requirements there, as do most countries within the world. Let's say that I have a contract of $100 million and the importing country requires me to do an offset of $50 million. Well, that alters a bit the way that you report. So SIPRI may look at it and say that contract is worth $100 million. But if you're doing $50 million worth of offsets in country, effectively, usually only that would mean that only $50 million is going back to the exporter in country to begin with. Right? And more on offsets as we go into next week, and then the week after, more this practical, how arms are actually transferred. If you're curious about offsets too, I did a short video on offsets on my YouTube page. And the reason why I'm posting these lectures on the YouTube site too isn't necessarily to get you guys to subscribe. That's not why I'm doing it. It's that D2L won't let me upload a lecture that's more than, I think it's like 2 gigs. And most of my lectures are well over that amount. So YouTube just allows me to upload these videos very quickly, and it's a pretty easy site for any of you guys to access. You don't necessarily have to log into D2L to be able to access the YouTube site that I have the majority of this information on. Anyway, let's keep it moving. Now that we've gone over the basics of arms transfer data and the strengths and weaknesses of the different sources, let's dive into real quickly the arms trade scholarship over the past 100 or so years. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because if you guys have ever been curious about arms transfers and arms sales prior and bought any books, you would see that the types of scholarship or the style of scholarship changes, with the era, which is really interesting in and of itself. So the one thing to remember whenever you're buying a book on arms sales or the arms trade, we have to remember that the literature tends to mirror the problems or concerns of the era, which usually oscillates between pro or anti-arms trade. Initially, when we're looking at kind of the first proto beginnings of arms trade scholarship, post World War One, most of this was very anti-arms trade. So you had books like War is a Racket and things like that that kind of followed um, this kind of generally accepted, and I'm not necessarily going to call it a myth. I would call it a myth in the way that I don't think the arms producers directly were looking to destroy the world. But it followed this myth that the reason why wars tend to take a longer amount of time, or the duration tends to be longer, is because war or weapons manufacturers tend to profit from these conflicts. The evidence for companies actually being able to sway conflicts and things like that is really, really low. So it's a pretty big myth. But that didn't stop the majority of the post World War One literature all saying that. Um, so we also just have to be aware. You had the same type of backlash after the Iran-Iraq war within the 80s, with how much arms were actually being funneled into both countries, which was an absolutely massive amount of arms. The fact is almost every country on earth who could export arms exported to that conflict, and it's pretty hard to it would be difficult and disingenuous to say that the massive amount of arms transfers being put into that conflict didn't result in a longer duration. I think that the evidence suggests that yes, it did. But we had another kind of wave of anti-arms trade scholarship follow that period of time. Quantitative scholarship that actually looks at the numbers and kind of the science and statistics of the arms trade is relatively new. And the reason for that is really prior to 1970, you really couldn't get a whole lot of statistical information on the amount of arms being traded throughout the world. So do keep in mind that when you're looking at arms trade scholarship really prior to 1970, this is primarily anecdotal and qualitative at the same time. There are also distinct phases of arms trade scholarship. So we have a distinct phase post World War One, which was very anti-war. Then we had a declining bipolar rivalry period, which nested arms trade as primarily seen as a tool of foreign policy. We had another wave in the post Gulf War era that kind of shifted more towards anti-arms trade again. And then we also have an era of increased interstate conflict, which looked at arms transfers and its effect on civil conflict within a particular state. So, giving you guys a little bit more of an in depth explanation of these different eras of arms transfer or arms trade scholarship. During the post World War I era, again, this was kind of a negative view of the arms trade. We're coming off of the tail end of World War I, and it was seen that arms manufacturers benefited and profited a lot from the conflict, and there seemed to be kind of a it's kind of great example of correlation doesn't exactly mean causation, right? Yes, arms manufacturers did profit from the war, but that does not mean that they kept the war going directly. But you did still see a real big wave of kind of this very pessimistic and anti-arms trade scholarship come out at this time. Probably the most famous book is going to be War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, who was actually a commander in World War One for U.S. forces. And these also come on the tail end of the governmental investigations that were being done both in the U.S. and the U.K. as well, looking at whether or not arms manufacturers actually did kind of precipitate the conflict. And of course, it was found that they didn't. But the scholarship really rode off of that. That really kept up pace until post World War II. Then you had an era of declining bipolar politics. Again, this had a negative view of arms, primarily focused on developing nations and their access to arms production and arms transfers. And it was kind of a mix between qualitative and quantitative research. But we also saw the rise of international relations scholarship during this exact same time period. So we're talking about the late 70s to the early 80s and late 80s as well. International relations scholarship really began to start to look at arms transfers as an independent variable to toss in to research. Then we had the second era, looking at the post Gulf War era. Again, this was a negative view of arms, focused on large arms trade in the 1980s. Again, this primarily looked at the fact that Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, the fact that they fought such a long war, the fact that Saddam became a threat to U.S. and Western interests within the region, the fact that he was armed with a lot of Western produced arms. Produced a backlash, essentially going, well, are we just selling arms to anybody? And isn't there an issue with that? Because obviously, if you sell arms to somebody who doesn't like us, and we may get shot with our own guns. So there was another kind of era of this negative view of arms transfers and arms production. And then you have the War on Terror era, which really shifted and looked at arms transfers' effect on civil conflict and kind of the rise of rebel groups and terror groups around the globe. So you did kind of have a shift of focus and the shift of the unit of analysis within this time period. And primarily looked at arms trade and its effect on intrastate conflict, as well as military expenditures effect on intrastate conflict, which is really interesting in and of itself. If you guys have a chance, take a look at some of the research that's been done within the last 20 years on military expenditure and its actual effect on civil conflict. It's really, really interesting there. The majority of this literature, basically from here on out, is primarily quantitative. And the reason for that is because the data is relatively easy to access. That might change a tad bit, just with the Department of State no longer reporting arms trade in an easy to access way. And then the downfall of the ACDA. So that may change a tad bit just with kind of the skewing of the numbers. And then with Russia, I don't necessarily know how cooperative Russia is necessarily going to be. As I guess what I'm trying to say is one thing that we have to keep in mind is the reason why arms transfer data was kind of an issue prior to 1970 is also when you're looking at large global rivalries, it becomes more difficult to kind of keep track of what arms are going where because the rivalries don't necessarily want to openly say that they're transferring or importing arms into particular eras or areas. But anyway, that's one thing to keep in mind is right now the majority of the arms transfer scholarship is going to be largely quantitative. It's beginning to shift back towards an interstate conflict kind of aspect to it. But one thing to keep in mind with all of this is the arms trade doesn't get a whole lot of love. And it only gets love usually right after wars and right after we've figured out that, well, if we don't pay attention to the arms trade, it usually has really bad effects. So you kind of see it come out in like fits and spurts. On the academic scholarship side, you really saw another rise of it, like probably early 2000s, along with the War on Terror, looking at the effect of arms transfers in general. But it's kind of declined a bit, and I've seen that at least on foreign affairs and kind of the more academically leaning media outlets, arms transfers is beginning to become an issue again. Just because I mean it's obviously in the news with the Ukrainian conflict and the conflict in the Middle East, but scholarship on it is still pretty scant. So we just have to use what we have, and I hope you come out of this course understanding that this is something that we obviously have to keep paying attention to. So let's go ahead and dive directly into kind of the meat and potatoes of this week's lecture and the information that is coming out of Edward Lawrence's book. All right, so the first era that Lawrence looks at is the era from 1930 to 1940. The first thing that we have to look at during this era is we have to define the boundaries and environment of this particular period of time. And of course, Lawrence defines it for us, says roughly it runs from about 1930 to 1940. We have to remember that arms trade lags behind larger political shifts as World War II approaches. So we're looking at a period of time in which the majority of the war is kind of gearing up to this, not necessarily inevitable conflict, but of course it did occur, so I guess in hindsight it was inevitable in that respect. But you also see conflicts kind of going on around the globe at this point in time, right? You also at the same time see kind of the fall of these larger powers, or at least the hegemonic powers, with Britain and the colonial powers of Britain and France begin to lose power. So you're seeing conflict kind of spurred up around the globe, and everybody kind of feels that they're going to gear up for this larger conflict. Lawrence also says that arms trade remained relatively laissez faire despite a shift to more national control of economies. So, what's really interesting about it is even though many more countries were kind of getting a more managed grip on the output and the inputs within the state economies, the trade in arms was still relatively uncontrolled. What's really interesting about this is remember if from the last few slides, the amount of public backlash that came out of World War One against the arms trade was kind of just window dressing. It didn't seem to really affect the behavior of many of these states and many of these private companies in trading, selling, and importing arms. Arms were still being traded around the globe, and arms were still being imported around the globe as well, right? Which is really interesting considering there was such a backlash prior. We also have to remember that there's a rapid technological change going on in this period. From 1930 to 1940, the speed of planes is almost doubling every 5 years, right? The types of weapons, you're going from bolt action to semi-auto. You're moving from these larger dreadnought battleships to more of these sleeker, faster running, larger gunned warships of conflict. You also have the rise of the aircraft carrier as well, and tactics are beginning to change along with that. So we have to keep that in mind as we're looking at this particular era of the arms trade system. Lawrence points out, interestingly, that even as states were gearing up towards war, and even though there was an increasing number of states which were operating under authoritarian style governmental regimes, the private arms firms and their subsidiaries still dominated the system with relatively little national control over their sales. Arms were still primarily traded for economic motivations instead of political motivations. The firms were still concerned about making money, and the governments didn't necessarily care a whole lot as long as they got their piece of the pie. As far as the taxes on the firms themselves, what we also saw was the fact that most of these states, even your larger, more powerful states like Germany and Britain, still imported a decent amount of arms from all over the globe. Germany relied a lot on Swedish weapons development prior to the war and so on. There was a large kind of laissez-faire style attitude at this point in time, which was primarily dominated by private firms and their subsidiaries. Now, as we're moving towards World War II, as war is getting closer, you begin to see the governments in Germany and Italy begin to take national control over arms production. And the primary reason for this is they needed to ensure that they could supply their own armies if they're going to go into war. So you do see that rapid decline in kind of private control and private decision making when it came to arms transfers around the globe during this period of time. And again, I can't stress this enough because this changes kind of period after period after period. Arms transfers and the motivation for arms transfers tend to oscillate between economic motivations and political motivations. They always have a mix of both, but usually during some era or another, it tends to lean more one way or more towards the other. At this point in time, again, these private firms were the primary exporters of arms, and they wanted to export arms to make money. So the acquisition rationales were not dependent on ideological and the political structure of the system, which is really interesting. It was economically motivated. Now, what was the structure and stratification of this particular era? Well, the major producers were primarily Western Europe and the US. These were the countries and these were the areas which supplied and produced the majority of arms that were going around the globe. Now, the Axis powers increased their market shares. We're talking about Germany and Italy. They increased their market share as World War II got closer. And this makes sense. They had to up production to equip their own military, so this makes a lot of sense. We also have to understand that many countries can independently produce their own major weapons systems. At this point in time, remember that although the tech is rapidly changing, the fact is it still wasn't that technologically advanced to build a plane. You may be able to build a plane now; it may not be the best one out there, but the fact is it wasn't necessarily that expensive to produce a plane in your own country. So you did see in small arms and things like that, the technology was out there. So you saw a lot of countries being able to produce a decent amount of military goods. I mean, if you look at the majority of the states in Europe, by the time World War II broke out, and they made most of their own stuff. They were fairly self-sufficient. Of course, they did import arms, and the export of arms was really big during this era. But I mean, Poland, Germany, France, Spain, they all produced their own planes. They all produced their own guns. They all produced their own cannon. So you did see a lot of countries being able to indigenously produce a wide range of military goods. Now, when we look at the countries that couldn't be self-sufficient, we find that dependence is largely a function of wealth. The wealthier the country, the less dependent they seem to be. And that makes sense because if you're a country that is wealthier, you're going to have the ability to invest in arms production, in arms, the ability to produce and trade arms at that point in time. If you didn't have a whole lot of money, it probably meant that you didn't have enough money to establish production within your own country, so importing was your next best choice. Now, how did the units interact during this point in time? Well, one really important thing to point out, and this is going to change, especially when we get into the post-Cold or the post-World War II era, there was almost no such thing as grant aid. And the reason for that is the credits and kind of the money that was going into states financing the purchase and production of arms usually came from private banks and firms. It didn't come from state governments itself. Remember that grant aid tends to come directly from the state. The majority of countries who were importing arms were doing so based on credit on private firms and banks, which is really interesting because that shifts dramatically post-World War II. Licensing is also the dominant form of transfer. So if you remember back to our first lecture when we looked at the gunpowder revolution and kind of how the technology was diffused during that point in time, it was the transfer of workers. Well, essentially, licensing does kind of the same thing. If you license produce a good, it means that you don't necessarily have to spend the brain power to design and develop a weapon of war. You can literally just buy the blueprint from the country next door, and if you have the ability to produce the basic parts for it, you can make it within your own country. So we're seeing licensing being tossed out everywhere. Your larger countries, which are developing, which are the forefront, kind of the tier one states who can produce and research and develop their own arms, they're selling that technology out. That's essentially what licensing is doing. But the interesting thing about the licensing is there was also very little co-production or co-development. So they were licensing the finished good out. So you could buy the blueprints for the plane and you could produce the plane within your own country. But there was little cooperation between countries to kind of co-develop, kind of co-research and develop a weapon of war and then co-produce it. It was pretty much if you wanted to buy the blueprint for it, you could, and then you could produce it in your own country. Now, how then can the system be characterized in terms of the norms, rules, and decision-making rules around which actors in the system converged? Well, for one, when we look at conflicts, we see that arms are being exported irrespective of ongoing or potential regional and international conflicts. So it didn't seem to matter if your country was in war, they could pretty much freely import arms. And countries who were exporting arms could freely export arms to states at war without too much of an issue. We also see that arms transfers are not critical in the development or the exacerbation of interstate conflict, or at least that's what was believed at this point in time. It wasn't until we're getting until, or it's not until we're getting to the buildup of World War II that states are beginning to understand that there could possibly be a link between arms transfers and the outbreak of conflict. As far as foreign policy and diplomacy is concerned, arms transfers didn't seem to coincide with the dominant international political structure at the time. And arms exports aren't being used as a particular valuable tool of foreign policy. Remember that states weren't the primary ones guiding arms transfers at this point in time. Even though arms producers may be in your state, you didn't, as a state power yourself, you didn't necessarily control what that private enterprise that was producing arms in your country did with the arms that they made. So arms exports weren't being used as this tool of foreign policy, which we'll see massively change in the next few eras. When we look at the economic effects of arms transfers during this particular period, we see that profits and benefits are primarily determined by market forces. And this makes sense if we remember that the reason why these private firms are transferring arms is primarily for economic motivations. It's just to make money. So we're seeing that the trade in arms is being dictated directly, and the profits and benefits of it are being determined directly by market forces. When we take into account arms control during this period of time, we don't see any type of arms control until the very end when we're building up to World War II. States like Britain and the US began to understand that as war was approaching, that it probably wasn't the best thing to allow states to export and import arms freely. They also needed to control the arms exports coming from their own countries. Prior to this kind of revelatory concept, states believed that you shouldn't restrict arms being transferred in or out of a particular country because it was the right of the country to import arms. States had a right to protect themselves, and therefore you shouldn't restrict the trade in arms. And it wasn't until the buildup and we got to the very precipice of conflict that states began to understand that if you allow arms to freely flow, the problem is the states that want to conduct war now have the ability to do it. Now let's get into the post-World War II period. The first post-World War II period that Lawrence speaks to is the period that runs from 1946 to 1966. And the boundaries and environment of this particular period are really interesting and are kind of the exact opposite of what we saw in the prior period. During this particular time, the trade in arms was directly linked with the bipolar political and ideological system, which meant that the states that aligned with you politically and ideologically were going to be the states that you imported and exported arms to. We also see that there's a narrow oligopolistic arms supplier market which is not linked to the dominant laissez-faire economic system. What does that mean? Essentially what that means is at the end of the war, there weren't too many states which could actually produce high-tech arms. You had the majority of Europe, who was kind of the basis for arms transfers prior to this period, was still recovering from the effects of World War II. So most of their arms production was pretty small or non-existent after the war, which meant that the main arms suppliers were going to be the US and Russia, and to a lesser extent Britain. So we see very few suppliers being able to supply new weapons around the globe. We also see that the advances in military technology have little impact on an arms trade dominated by older surplus weapons systems. What we also saw was that the trade in arms during this point in time didn't usually encompass state-of-the-art arms. We saw a large trade in surplus goods from World War II. The U.S. had a lot of it. And if they were going to build up, and Russia also did too, if these two superpowers at the time were going to try to build up their alliances around the globe, they were going to use the massive amount of old surplus arms to do it. So you saw a lot of arms transfers encompassing these older surplus goods. Looking at the characteristics of the units within this period of time, we see that the suppliers are now national governments. Private arms firms may be producing arms within the US and may be producing arms in Britain, but the export of arms is now being strictly controlled by the national governments. When we look at Russia, the arms production and trade was entirely controlled by the government. So the suppliers are national governments now. They aren't private firms. We also see that the ratio of exports to production is low. This is also because we're seeing a lot of the export of old surplus equipment. So this new production isn't necessarily being exported directly out, it's being used to arm these superpowers, the US and Russia, with the newest, most advanced goods that their own states could produce. The majority of the recipients here are going to be new states and potential clients of the two superpowers and pre World War II powers who are rebuilding. So you're beginning to see with the decolonization of Africa and Southeast Asia, these newly formed states are beginning to import arms from one of the two superpowers. We also see most of the powers in Europe, especially Western Europe, are beginning to import U.S. arms at that point in time, and Eastern Europe is beginning to import Russian-made arms at that point in time as well. We also see that there are multiple supplier relationships. So an importing state may be importing from multiple other states. We also see that the acquisition rationales are not dependent upon ideological and the political structure of the system at the time. When we look at the structure and stratification of this particular era, we see that the US and the USSR dominate the arms transfer system itself. They're the primary exporters, they're the primary producers. On the importer side, we see that there are a lot of sole and predominant supplier recipient patterns. What does that mean? That essentially means that if you're a state at this point in time, you're usually going to import from one or the other, or if you're importing from multiple states, they're usually going to be politically aligned with each other. That means that if I'm a state that imports arms from the US, I may also import arms from Britain and France. The kind of how that changes is when we look at the USSR, the states that primarily import arms from the USSR are primarily solely importing arms from the USSR just because there aren't too many other suppliers that are producing the quality and the quantity of goods as a USSR that are politically aligned with the USSR during this particular period. Going on to look at the modes of interaction during this particular era, we're seeing that grant aid is going to be the predominant mode of payment. Your larger states like the USSR and the US are giving grant aid to states to purchase arms. And again, the majority of the arms that are being transferred by these two states at this period of time are going to be older surplus arms. We also see that the dominant mode of production is off the shelf to the third world and licensing within the blocks. So you're seeing this kind of surplus or outright buy of goods in the third world, and then licensing, where the France is asking the U.S. if they could get the information and the technology to build a particular weapons platform. You're seeing that going on within the blocks, within these larger blocks. So Europe is primarily aligned with the U.S. and the quote-unquote West, and we're looking at Eastern Europe, and those blocks are beginning to license produce Russian-developed goods. So again, you're seeing off-the-shelf buys to the third world, so this larger surplus equipment are just directly selling them the tanks that your state makes, but you're seeing licensing within the blocks, and this is kind of helping the countries that were ravaged by World War II kind of build up the production capacity that they had prior to the war. And when we look at this in a superpower sense, it behooved the US and Russia to kind of support and invest in these countries being able to produce their own arms, because you could also use those arms to export yourself. Now, lastly, we're going to look at the regime, norms, and rules within this particular era. Looking at conflict, we see that arms are being exported as a function of regional conflicts associated with the larger East-West rivalry. So arms transfers are being transferred to nations that are going to be in rivalries politically and ideologically that align with the superpowers. We're also seeing that arms transfers are becoming a major instrument of national security policy. If the US or Russia found a state that they would like to bolster their interests in, the natural response was to ship them arms. The more secure that state is, the less influence, at least it was perceived, the less influence that the competing superpower would have in that particular nation. When we look at foreign policy and diplomacy, arms transfers are being used as a tool of foreign policy to signify and cement political alignment. If I'm the US or if I'm Russia and I am exporting arms to another state, that signifies that we are aligned both politically and security wise too. Arms transfers are also being used at this point in time to coerce and influence the behavior of the recipient states. So when we look at conflicts which are going on, we're seeing the first instance in which countries are beginning to withhold arms or ship more arms to exacerbate that country's behavior in war, or even exacerbate or change or coerce domestic political behavior in an importing state. If a state solely relies upon the US or Russia for the importation of arms, then it's likely going to be concerned about the ability to continue to import arms. So that is a level of power that the exporting state has over the importing state. And the exporting state, like the US and Russia, use arms as leverage. They're trying to get states to do particular things that align politically or with the national interests of one of the two superpowers. The economic effects here are not as much as during the last period, partially because arms transfers are primarily being paid for by military aid and grant aid. That's not directly affecting or directly investing in economic economic interests within the country, right? Because this is grant aid. It's not actually being paid for by money. So these states who are importing arms aren't usually directly paying, right? The majority of their arms is through credit or through aid. So the money's not necessarily there. When we look at arms trade control, we see that national controls are rising. States like the US and Russia are beginning to strictly control the production and export of arms out of their states. And they're also beginning to control other states which politically aligned with them as far as their export behavior. If we look at states like Britain in terms of arms transfers during this period, Britain is not going to get away with exporting its arms all around the globe without checking with the US first. So we see that national controls are rising, and even the control that the superpowers have over these smaller powers, which may ideologically and politically align with them, the power that they have over their arms transfer decisions is rising here. So national control is rising for arms transfers all around the globe. There are still no multilateral or international control at this point in time. There's been talk about it. You see that there's been control on nuclear weapons at this point in time. But as far as the trade in conventional arms, there's really no multilateral or international controls in place or even really being thought of at this point in time. Looking at the next period, running from 1966 to 1980, we see that there's changes going on within the boundaries and environment within this particular era compared to the previous era. For one, we're seeing that there's a loosening of the bipolar political system at this point in time, which is leading to intra-bloc arms trade rivalries. So if we look at the bloc that the USSR associates with, so it's going to be the USSR and China. And if we look at the Western bloc, we're looking at the US, Britain, and France, to name a few. You're seeing that these other countries are beginning to export more of their own arms. So China is beginning to export its arms around the globe, competing with Russian arms. French arms are being transferred around the globe as well, competing with US arms and British arms. So we're seeing that because there is this kind of, with the rise of the policy of détente starting in 1969, the easing of this bipolar political system is allowing these smaller client states like Britain, France, who have the production capabilities, begin to actually take their own part in interacting in the arms trade system at this point in time. We also see that continuing East-West conflict continues to fuel arms trading, but it shifts regions from Europe over to Asia. So this east-west conflict, these proxy conflicts going on in Southeast Asia, still fuel the arms trading behavior and even the arms production impetus into the larger countries like the U.S. and Russia. But it's shifting from Europe over to Asia. Economic recovery in Europe results in increased competition. Remember the second bullet point here: the loosening of bipolar political system leads to intra-bloc arms trade rivalries. This other bullet, economic recovery in Europe, results in increased competition, plays into that bullet. It's going, these states like France, Britain, Poland too, to a degree on the USSR side, they're beginning to produce their own arms again, and they're beginning to take part in the international trade system at this point in time. There's also an influx of money at this point in time globally. You know, we're seeing the rise of the oil powers and the rise of oil prices. So these countries, which are profiting massively from the export of oil, are also using that money to buy arms. So you see that the petrodollars means that there's more recipients. There's more states now that pump oil that now have the money to actually buy arms. So not only are there more suppliers on the stage as Europe begins to recover, and as states like China begin to increase their production capacity, not only is there more competition on the export side, there's more recipients to then kind of market to and get the money from because of this increase in petrodollars at this point in time. Also, the increased cost of systems and petrodollars encourages export behavior. We're beginning to enter more of this technology and computerized age at this point in time, right? We're moving away from these very basic weapon systems where you just had to put an engine into a propeller plane and it flew and you just toss guns on it and ta-da, you get a fighter aircraft, right? Now with jet technology, because the increased technology you have to produce arms like jets, you know, like the new battleships at this point in time, missile tech really comes into its own now, right? These things cost a lot of money to research and develop. One way for a state to offset the cost of the research and development is to export these arms out for cash. Remember during the previous period where the majority of arms transfers were paid for by grant aid, you're seeing that shift now, also because of the rise in petrodollars around the globe. As the world begins to recover from World War II, most states begin to have more money to actually pay for the arms with rather than using grant aid. The plus of them paying for their own arms is the fact that now they likely have access to more high-tech arms. If you're only going to pay for it with grant aid, chances are the U.S. isn't going to ship you their best, newest stuff. They're going to send you the old stuff that they have in the boneyard here in Tucson, right? But if you have money, you can now compete and actually ask for the newer stuff. The problem for the tier one producers like France, Britain, Russia, and the US is for you to keep fielding the most technologically advanced equipment, your research and development is becoming more and more costly. Weapon systems themselves are becoming more and more costly. One way to offset that cost is to be able to export out your arms for cash to offset the amount of money that you're trying to invest to create this new tech. And that's a practice that really began during this era and continues today. Being able to export out arms allows the producing country to offset those research and development, those kind of non-recurring engineering costs. And this is the first time in which this is really beginning to happen. What are the characteristics of the units of this particular era? Well, the suppliers are primarily national governments, no real change from the previous era. But multinational corporations begin to emerge. So you're seeing multinational corporations in Europe really begin to come online. And the reason for that is because arms are becoming increasingly expensive to produce. To kind of like spread out the cost of developing these new high-tech arms, one way to do it is to create these multinational corporations which allow you to share the burden of developing new arms. We're also seeing that the ratio of export to production increases dramatically. What does that mean? Well, that means that more states are participating in actually exporting arms. Not only are they producing arms, they're beginning to export them out. Looking at the recipient side, we see that the recipients are primarily developing countries during this point in time, and they're increasingly unconnected from the East West conflict. So, yes, the superpowers are exporting to countries which are participating in kind of this East West rivalry, but when we're looking at the arms transfer system as a whole, majority of these developing nations really aren't taking part in either the East or the West, but they're importing arms like crazy. Now let's go ahead and look at the structure and stratification during this particular period. The biggest thing that you need to understand is that the arms transfers have increased by 400% during this period. The number of new suppliers has doubled, and there's 33 new recipients. Now, the USSR and the US are now competing against European suppliers in developing industries. Remember that in the earlier era, the primary suppliers were the US and Russia. Now, as Europe begins to rebuild, now that other countries are beginning to acquire the production capacity, like China, the arms export market is becoming increasingly competitive. You aren't just having the choice between the US or Russia. Now you have a myriad of choices. We also see the proliferation of advanced weapons throughout the system at this point in time. If we're looking at missile exports, we're seeing missile exports, which at this point in time, missiles were the newest, most advanced thing. You're seeing those exported out to developing nations, and this shocked a lot of researchers at this point in time because they're seeing developing nations acquire capabilities that were traditionally only held by superpowers or large powers. So you're seeing this large amount of military capability being freely exported out to a country which traditionally never would ever have that power to begin with. We're also seeing a shift from Asia to the Middle East. This is in the latter period. So remember, during the early period, we're seeing this kind of shift between going from Europe, going to Southeast Asia. Now the majority of your arms transfers, as far as the superpower blocks are concerned, is now going to the Middle East. Looking at the modes of interaction during this particular period, we see that cash and credit become the dominant forms of payment. And again, this is going back to the fact that countries are beginning to recover from World War II. Now they're beginning to produce their own goods. They're beginning to become economically self-sufficient again, which means that they have cash to spend, and they're going to spend it on arms. We also see that license production increases in the developing world. In the era prior to this, license production existed, but it was primarily in Europe, where you had these larger powers like France and Britain who had the capacity to produce these arms, asked for license production from states like the US. But what you're seeing during this era is the license production is shifting from Europe into these developing countries within the Middle East, within Southeast Asia, and even within Africa as well. We have to remember that with license production, part of the reason why states want license production is because they want to develop their own capacity to build their own arms. So during this period, developing nations are beginning to understand that the only way to become truly independent, the only way to kind of get out of the yoke of these post-colonialist ties, is to be able to be self-sufficient in producing your own arms. Because if you don't, chances are you're going to have to import from the US or Russia if you want the newest, best stuff. And that comes with strings attached, right? That means that you're going to have to look out for the interests of either Russia or the US. And these states don't want to do it. So they're seeing getting licensed production as a way to kind of jumpstart their own production domestically within their country. We're also seeing the rise of co-production in the developed world. So you're seeing co-production primarily within Europe at this point in time. And again, the reason for that is because it shares the burden of the costs of production and development. So as these arms are becoming more expensive, the way that states, especially within Europe and Western Europe, the way that they're kind of offsetting the cost is creating these co-production deals with other states. So it decreases the amount of money that they are going to have to spend on the research and development on any one weapon. We also see the rise of multinational production too, and again, this is also in Europe. So you're beginning to see the share of the costs, the burden of the cost of research and development. Now let's look at the regime norms and rules during this particular period. Let me start with the fact that remember on the first slide when we went over the boundaries and environments and the structure and stratification of this particular era. The fact that you're having a rise in suppliers around the globe has a massive effect on the regime norms and rules during this particular era. Remember that prior to this era, you really only had a few states to choose from if you wanted to import arms. Now you had a plethora. The problem with that is that superpowers began to find that they couldn't control states as much as they could prior because they no longer had the leverage. If Egypt was importing arms from Russia and Russia was telling Egypt to do something that Egypt didn't necessarily want to do, then they would just give them the middle finger and switch to importing arms from the U.S. Right? Because there's more suppliers of arms, the leverage that any one state has decreases. Okay? So there's less ability for the superpowers to use arms to actually coerce behavior by states who are importing arms. So when we look at conflict, we're finding that the superpowers are finding it difficult to control conflict due to the proliferation of suppliers. As far as foreign policy and diplomacy is concerned, arms transfers are increasingly ineffective in influencing recipient behavior, especially within the short term, because the recipients have a multitude of states to import arms from. So arms transfers are becoming increasingly ineffective in influencing behavior because the recipient, if they don't like the leverage that the exporting state is placing upon them, they can just switch to another seller, right? You're looking at a buyer's market. The buyers have multiple sellers to buy from now, which means that any one seller has less leverage over the buyer. When we look at the economic effects, major arms producers are being forced to export or die. What that essentially means is because there's so many more suppliers of arms out there, major arms producers have to export, or they're not going to have enough money to keep the production and research and development going. So not only is the international arms transfer system becoming more competitive because there's more suppliers of arms, but we also have to keep in mind that arms are becoming increasingly technologically advanced. They're becoming more expensive to research and develop and produce. And because of that, they have to export arms because the state itself, arms are becoming so expensive that only a few states can actually afford to fully fund the research and development of a technologically advanced system. That's why you're seeing this rise in co-production and multinational production is because it's becoming so expensive. One way to offset those costs is if you don't want to engage in multinational production or co-production because you don't want to share technology with another country, it means you have to export arms. So in a few weeks, you'll read a book that looks over France's export policy since World War II, and France is a really great example. France wants to stay self-sufficient in the production of arms. They want to be able to produce the majority of their arms domestically. They don't want to have to rely on importing arms because to them, being able to produce your own arms means that you are a truly independent nation. You can make your own choices because you're never going to have to worry about if the supply of arms is going to be cut off if you go into conflict. But if you're a small nation, you don't have the ability to tax the amount that's going to be required for you to fully fund the research and development of new technologically advanced systems. Now, why do you want to produce technologically advanced pieces of equipment? First, it's because you want your own military equipped with the newest, best stuff. But if you want to export out, you have to create the newest, best stuff for somebody to go, I really want to buy that, right? Tier 1 states have to constantly invest in research and development, not only to keep their own militaries at the tip top, but also to keep their arms production going with it being subsidized by export money. The only way to export arms is to make a nice, sexy good that other states are going to want. They aren't going to want old crap. They're going to want the newest stuff. So the more technologically advanced your equipment is, the more likely you are going to be able to export it, which means the more likely you are going to get money from exports to pour back in. So, with all that being said, major arms producers realize with the increasing competition and the increasing cost of the production of arms, they have to export or they're going to die. Licensed production also is found not to lead to independent arms production. That's important because states are beginning to look for licensed production to jumpstart their own arms production. And you'll still see that again and again in today's world as well. Smaller developing nations are going to want to produce their own arms. And in their view, they say, okay, well, if I license produce something, it means that you're going to help me. So, like, let's say that I'm Saudi Arabia and I go to the U.S. and I say, I want to license produce an F-15 plane. If the U.S. says yes, then you can produce it within your own country. The reason why you want to do that, at least in theory, is because you say, if I can get my populace to learn how to make this plane, then we should be able to make other planes, right? It's kind of like this spin-off thing of like, once I kind of jumpstart arms production, then it's naturally just going to grow. But these developing nations realize that it takes a lot more than just license producing arms. You have to have a knowledge base. You have to have the funding. You have to have the education. You can't just put a factory within a developing world and expect them to produce the highest tech goods. You have to have kind of these capital and social investments already existing within your country. Not only do you have to have the money, but you have to have the scientific expertise within the country to actually develop and keep evolving that technology. And most states just don't have that. This era was really the failure of these states trying to domestically produce their own arms, the failure of these developing states. You see many states. You have Ethiopia, Brazil's first jumpstart, which utterly failed, was at this point in time too. You're seeing these states try to develop their own arms and fail because they just don't realize that it doesn't matter if you are able to license produce a good. That doesn't necessarily mean that once you get that done, you're going to be able to produce everything else. There's a lot more that goes into it than just licensed production. Now, when we look at arms trade control, national control is increased even more at this point in time. Nations want to keep a hold of what they produce and what they trade, and they want to keep track of it. What we also see during this point in time is multilateral export control is beginning to be talked about, but it's being resisted by exporters because of the need to export and because of national security considerations by the recipient. So it's beginning to be understood that the trade in conventional arms should probably be controlled in some way, right? Because we understand that although the transfer of arms may not directly create conflict, it definitely creates the conditions for conflict. Because if you want to engage in war, you have to have the ability and you have to have the tools to fight a war, which means that arms transfers are necessary for conflict to take place. So multilateral export control is being talked about, right? Prior to this era, you had unilateral arms embargoes, which worked really, really well when you only had a few suppliers within the world. And you'll see that during the last week when we go into conflict cases. When you worked in an era where you could really only import arms from the U.S. or Russia, unilateral arms embargoes by the U.S. or Russia tended to work really, really well. But as the number of producers multiplied during this point in time, there was a need, like unilateral arms embargoes didn't matter now. Because if the U.S. said, no, I'm not going to ship arms to you, then the country would just look to somebody else. Okay? So we began to understand that unilateral arms embargoes no longer work, so you had to create multilateral export control. But it was resisted by both the exporters and the importers. It was resisted by the exporters because the exporting countries needed the money that came from exports to keep their own production going. And on the recipient side, the recipients didn't want multilateral export control to be there because they saw the import of arms as pivotal to their national security. If they can't produce arms, they should be able to freely acquire arms. At least that's what their view was. All right, welcome to the wild, wild west of arms transfers. This particular era was kind of the pinnacle of laissez-faire arms transfer behavior around the globe, and it resulted in a lot of bad things. So let's go ahead and get this kick-started. So in this particular era, we're looking at 1980 to 1992. We see that the steady decline of the bipolar political system meant that few arms deals are based on the East-West rivalry. So now you're seeing arms being imported into countries from multiple nations and not necessarily along ideological or political lines. So prior to this era, usually if you were an importing state, yes, you had a multitude of suppliers to choose from, but usually you chose suppliers within a particular block. So if you were importing arms from Russia, and then you no longer wanted to import arms from Russia, you could import arms from China without too much of a change in political or ideological leaning. And the same goes with if you were importing arms from the U.S. and you didn't want to import arms from the U.S. Anymore, the easiest next choice would be France or Britain or somebody from the West, because it wouldn't necessarily upset the superpower at that point in time. But what you're seeing is during this period, as the Soviet Union's power begins to wane, and as the U.S. and the USSR are less contentious with each other, you're seeing that fewer arms deals are based upon that political and ideological rivalry. What does that mean? That means if I'm a state and I import arms, I might import arms from Russia and the U.S. at the same time. Or I might import arms from France and import arms from China at the same time. And there wasn't consequences for that, and that wasn't necessarily perceived as odd. So this was like a laissez-faire. If they were selling, you could buy. We also see that centrally controlled economies are being discredited at this point in time. You're seeing the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And arms are being exported more as a commercial commodity at this point in time. As the political and ideological East-West rivalry decreases, it means the arms transfers are using less as a tool of foreign policy and more just as a pure tool of commercial and economic interest. The more that I export, the more money I could make from that, which means the better arms that I could make to equip my own army. So all states were kind of seeing arms as a way to not only invest in the military technology that they could field themselves, but also just as a general economic powerhouse within their own country, which could contribute to the economic wealth, right? Like it was no different than if you shipped out a whole bunch of cars. Right? The car industry employs a lot and it brings a lot of money into your state, and you want to transfer as many cars as you can, or you want to export out as many cars as you can around the world. Arms were kind of being seen in the same light at this point in time. The suppliers are still primarily going to be major powers. And the reason why this kind of switches is, although there is a rise in the number of suppliers in the previous era, as arms are becoming more technologically advanced, fewer and fewer states are actually able to produce those arms. So you have a lot of arms producers, but many arms producers can only produce basic arms, rifles, small arms, things like that aren't necessarily that technologically advanced. Your choices to buy technologically advanced arms were only a few states, and they were primarily major powers: Britain, France, the U.S., Russia, China, and so on. What were the characteristics of the units at this particular time? Private national, multinational firms have gained enough independence from national control to become major actors in the systems themselves. You're now beginning to see private companies, although the pri- I'm beginning to get out ahead of myself here, and I don't want you guys to get confused. Although governments have the ultimate say on where the private companies within their state can transfer arms to, private companies are beginning to understand that they can market out themselves. So if we take a look at today, if we take a look at a Raytheon, if Raytheon wants to export out a particular missile, they're going to have to get permission from the government, from the U.S. government, for the export of that missile. However, that doesn't stop Raytheon from marketing and going out to find buyers. And this is kind of what you're seeing at this point in time. Private national, multinational firms are gaining enough independence from national control. Now they can actually go out and market. They can go out and kind of hawk their goods. Yes, they're going to have to get the permission from the nation to export those arms, but they can still act as kind of control their own destiny in a way. We are also seeing second tier suppliers provide low to mid level technology armaments. So at this point in time, you're seeing your major powers producing those really high tech arms, but you're seeing second tier suppliers being able to provide low to mid level tech. So there are more suppliers, but there's only a few for the high tech goods, and everybody else is kind of producing those lower to mid tech technology goods. We're also seeing at this point in time that recipients are beginning to have a lack of capital to purchase arms. So part of the petrodollars are beginning to dry up. You're also seeing the two major states, Iran and Iraq, in conflict at this point in time. So all of the money that they're making from oil, they're spending on arms, but it also becomes a point to where the fighting goes on for so long that it actually decreases oil output within those countries, right? So there's less money going around. With the decline in the bipolar political and ideological system, what you're seeing also is less proxy or regional conflicts being fueled by superpower political and superpower politics and ideology. The reason why that's important to bring up is because as the superpowers are becoming less contentious, you're having less of a reason for arms actually to be sent out. The world is becoming less guided by that superpower interest, which also funnels money into buy arms. The structure and stratification during this particular era is interesting as well. So there is an overall decline in global arms sales, and this is especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the reason for that is because there's a decline in the proxy conflicts. The world is seen as an overall just more peaceful place now that you don't necessarily have these two superpowers going at it, and the prevalence of interstate conflict decreases. Intrastate does increase, but interstate does decrease, which means that there's not necessarily as much of a demand for arms out there. We also see that the number of suppliers and recipients at this point in time are leveling out, so they are no longer increasing or decreasing at significant levels. Most of the sales during this particular time are going to be to developing nations, and the vast majority of the sales are going to Iran and Iraq. Almost every state that could produce arms, and this is not a figure of speech, you can take a look at the stats on SIPRI. From 1980 to 89, almost every state that could produce arms did ship them to either Iran or Iraq. It was an absolute melee for about 10 years. We also see that the supplier market to buyers market, we see a shift from the supplier market to a buyer's market due to the decreased domestic procurement budgets in major suppliers. So because your major powers like the U.S. are decreasing their military expenditures, what you're seeing is the arms producers within those nations can no longer rely on the U.S. government for the money, so they have to increasingly look out for exports. So not only were they trying to export prior, now they have to export even more because they aren't getting as much money from their domestic procurement budgets as they were prior. Conflicts in the Middle East dominate the demand for arms during this period. And then we also see that there is significant proliferation of high technology weapons to developing nations, namely Iran, Iraq, and even into sub Saharan Africa. So we're seeing these smaller states, if they have the money, they're being able to procure higher tech weaponry, which was traditionally only given to major powers. What do we see during this point in time? Well, we see that arms trade is becoming more commercial in nature. States are beginning to export arms, primarily motivated by economic reasons, to not only keep their production going, to keep their arms companies employed, but also to contribute to the national GDP of the country itself. So arms are seen more as a commercial commodity than they are anything else during this point in time. We also, again, see an increase in the internationalization of production. Um, so not only are you seeing these large multinational firms within Europe producing like the Panavia Tornado, the Eurofighter is a good example of this, where these are multinational efforts to produce one good. You're also seeing the internationalization of production of subgoods. So your major tier producers like the U.S. may produce, let's use the F-35 as an example here. The U.S. may look like it produces the F-35, but the fact is we only produce particular parts of that. We internationalize the production chain, right? So we may import the landing gear from Italy. We may import the tail wing from Britain. We're beginning to internationalize the production of any one primary good. And part of the reason for that is because of this rise in offsets, because if a country is going to buy arms, now they're increasingly demanding an offset, which essentially means that the country is trying to offset the cost of an arm. But you're also seeing that it's cheaper to produce in particular other countries, which would make the end good cheaper. So it would make the F-35 less expensive and more marketable to other countries. Going back to offsets, because buyers within this point in time, remember that this is a buyer's market, the producing states want to export as much as they possibly can. States who are importing arms see that and they leverage that and they say, if you need to sell arms, I will buy under particular conditions. And one of those conditions is called offsets, and that's just trying to offset the cost of a good. So again, let's say that I am India and I'm looking to buy an F-35 from the U.S. And the U.S. may say, okay, I'm willing to sell this to you for $10 million. I realize they're much more than $10 million. But let's say the U.S. says that, okay, India, you want to buy one F-35, it's going to cost you $10 million. And India then goes, I know that you really need to sell that and you really need the money from the sale. So I'll buy it from you for $10 million as long as you offset $5 million of that within my own country. Now, you could do a direct offset, which means that there has to be some offset of the primary good within the importing country. What does that essentially mean? That means if I want a direct offset, I'm telling you that if I buy your plane, you have to let me build a piece of the plane within my country to offset the cost. So, let's say that the plane is $10 million. I'm saying that I'm requiring a $5 million direct offset. What that essentially means is that I have to do $5 million of work within my own country to offset the $10 million. So when all is said and done in theory, India's really only paying $5 million to the U.S. for that plane because the other $5 is being spent in India itself producing a piece of that plane. Anyway, So offsets are becoming more normalized at this point in time because it is a buyer's market, and even today, offsets exist in almost every country that I've ever dealt with in my own profession, and I'm fairly sure. Probably, I would estimate probably around 80% of the world requires some form of offset. And the reason for that is also you have to remember at this point in time, not only do importing states want to offset the cost because well they just want to save money, but it's also because these weapons are becoming increasingly expensive, right? Like some countries just don't have the actual liquidity in hand to outright buy a plane, so they need to require an offset. The negotiating arms transfers becomes multilateral in scope. So if arms transfers are involving a number of different suppliers, so negotiating an arms transfer, you may have to negotiate with more than one state, and that really becomes a thing now because, or not now, but in this period of time, just because there's so many suppliers out there. And also because the internationalized production also means that you may have to, if I'm going to buy a Eurofighter, which is um, God, I feel like I'm going to get this wrong. Is it German, British, Spanish, and Italian, I believe. If I want to buy a Eurofighter, it means that I may have to jump through the hoops of getting the approval from Italy, from Britain, from France, from Spain, right? From all the countries who take part in actually producing that arm. And then the illegal arms trade returns to the system. Now, the reason why the illegal arms trade, it was always around. The reason why it really rose during this point in time was with the fall of the Soviet Union. The amount of weaponry that was in surplus in various Eastern Bloc nations was enormous, and the majority of these nations needed cash. And they found cash in very interesting ways. So if you've ever seen the movie Lord of War with Nick Cage, he pretty succinctly that movie pretty succinctly sums it up. You had many independent nations at that point in time, which were cash poor. So the nations were trying to make money themselves, and the average soldier at that point in time, may be found without a paycheck. So they were willing to kind of offload some of the arms that they may have access to. So you really do see the rise in the illegal arms trade during this point in time. Now, lastly, for this particular lecture, let's go over the regime norms and rules during this era. When we look at conflict, we see that suppliers are no longer able to control conflict with transfer policies. So suppliers are becoming less and less able to actually control conflict. And this primarily affects your major powers like the US and Russia. In previous eras, they were able to kind of control the direction of conflict. Now they're less able to do that. Recipient states are now acquiring arms to directly confront major powers. A great example of that would be the Gulf War, and even if we look at 2003 as well, you're looking at states that are able to acquire on the open market advanced arms that can compete with anything that a major power would have. When we look at foreign policy and diplomacy, we find that arms transfers are not a reliable method of securing political alignment and are decreasingly used by supplier states for this purpose. So it's really interesting that we seem to, I think the average belief is we still perceive arms transfers as a tool of foreign policy. And I think that it still is, and I think the evidence is overwhelmingly there that it can still be used as a tool of foreign policy. But arms transfers are less a tool of foreign policy in a coercive way. They're better used as a carrot now than a stick, because if you're using them as a stick and you're trying to coerce a recipient, they have so many other states that they could buy arms from that they can just say, yeah, I don't want to put up with this, I'm just going to go to somebody else. And you see this behavior even today. So the Saudis are decently good at leveraging the U.S. The Egyptians are incredibly good at it. But you'll see with the stalling of arms transfers to Saudi began. And I should put that in context. During the Saudi Yemen war, in the late 2010s, there was a push to stall arms transfers from the U.S. To Saudi Arabia because of certain human rights abuses and certain unethical ways in which the Saudis were conducting warfare within Yemen. So essentially, we stalled arms transfers from the U.S. to Saudi, and Saudi essentially said, "That's fine. I'll just go find another buyer." Now, eventually, we still sent the arms there, um, but it did cause an issue, and it highlighted the fact that the arms transfer system today, there's so many sellers out there that you can't stall arms transfers and expect a change of policy in the importing state, even a state which primarily imports from you. Now, is that to say that arms transfers cannot be a useful tool of policy? Yes, they still can be, but usually they're used to kind of they're better used to sweeten deals now, not to coerce a state. So, arms transfers themselves aren't necessarily as valuable as a foreign policy tool as they used to be. There is no state that's going to acquiesce to everything that the U.S. wants just because we're willing to sell them a plane. That may have been the case right after World War II, but because they have so many other states they can choose to buy arms from, that's just not really there as much now as it was in the past. The economic effects. Declining military expenditure is forcing states to aggressively pursue exports. So you actually saw within the U.S. itself this huge push for export after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. You also saw a dramatic drop in military expenditure within the U.S. And the Clinton administration actually met with the CEOs of the largest defense producers at the time and essentially told them at a roundtable discussion that they either had to merge or they had to export out. And that's why we also had this merger mania in the mid to late 90s with our defense corporations here in the U.S. Because the defense production couldn't rely upon domestic procurement at the same rate as they did in the 80s, you saw this push to either merge or to fail or to export out like crazy. So the U.S. exported arms prior to the 1990s, of course. But really, post 1995 is when you saw this really big push by arms producing corporations themselves within the U.S. actually actively developing things for export in mind. That really never happened before. Now, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, when they're doing research and development for a new weapons platform, oftentimes they have export in mind. So they may come to the drawing board and go, this is going to be version 1 and another is going to be version 2. So it may be the same plane, but version 1 is going to have all the cool tech that Lockheed knows that the U.S. will not allow them to export out. And the other one is going to be the same plane, but without that tech that Lockheed knows that they can use that for export to offset the costs, right? So this is the beginning of the period of time in which arms producing companies and nations are beginning to understand that to be a viable producer, to actually survive in this increasingly competitive arms transfer system, you have to export, and you have to keep export in mind as you're developing on the front end as well. So we also find during this period of time that demand is still high for arms, but the cash is now limited. So we see that credit and offset arrangements are becoming increasingly popular. And not only is cash limited at this point in time, partially because your two major your two major buyers during this period of time, Iran and Iraq, by the end of the 80s, just were basically broke, and you weren't able to actually export arms out to them in the first place. But it's also because the weapons themselves are becoming increasingly expensive, right? So credit and offset arrangements are becoming increasingly popular during this period of time. When we look at arms trade control, we see the missile technology control regime come into play here, and you're seeing other control mechanisms for super high tech goods primarily going to developing nations. So, arms control regimes during this period of time are focusing on inhibiting developing nations from acquiring significant military capabilities such as ballistic missiles. But the average trade in the conventional arms still kind of remains the norm and is fairly uncontrolled and remains fairly uncontrolled today.